I want to first start with the current war in Ukraine, given that this is a war being not just prosecuted by a Democratic president, but supported by virtually the entire Democratic Party, at least on the national elected level. President Biden himself, who's conducting this proxy war, says the world is closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point since 1962 because of this war. And yet, since he said that, he's continued to escalate the U.S. role in that war. I want to ask you about the domestic politics in a second, but first, what about the war itself and the U.S. role in it? What do you make of that?
Well, I think the first thing to make of it is there's been an absolute collapse in what used to be called the left on the issue of war, U.S. foreign policy, which to my recollection, at any rate, is unprecedented. Nowadays, when you want to find out what's going on or to hear an alternative point of view, I have to tune into this guy, Mr. McGregor, a former military person, or I have to tune into
Who's only on Fox News. He's on
quite a few, I think, right-wing news programs, catch on YouTube. Or I turn it to John Mearsheimer, who's a wonderful guy, but politically he's a conventional realist political theorist, or several others, a couple of liberals, but absolutely nobody on the left has anything critical to say about the war. That's very unusual. I go back quite a long ways, and to have no left criticism of a U.S. war, maybe that hasn't happened since World War II, if you could believe that. I think that's an accurate statement. So that's the first thing. As to the war itself, there have been a certain number of voices on the left, including yourself, who have gone so far as to say that the war was provoked. And you can hear statements like that from Professor Chomsky, from Professor Mearsheimer, from Aaron Mate, what's the fellow's name from Columbia? His name just
Jeffrey Sachs.
Yeah, Jeffrey Sachs. But there's always a limit to that criticism. And the criticism always is, yes, he was the Russians. I don't like to say Putin because it's the entire political elite in Russia who are supporting the war. And I think overwhelmingly the population, though you could say the population because they're manipulated by government propaganda, so we'll set them aside for a moment. The limit always is, yes, he was provoked, yes, he was provoked, yes, you could see a sequence of events beginning with the decomposition of the Soviet Union into Russia, from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin to Medvedev. Everybody will grant that, but then there's a limit. And the limit is still the war was an act of aggression and the war has to be condemned. I don't accept that limit. I'm not going to squander your time now to going through my own reasoning, but I think the challenge is, in my opinion, of people like yourself. At what point does a provocation become so severe, so outrageous, that a country has the right to react? I remember, just to give you a kind of analogy, not perfect, but an analogy. You're too young, I think, to remember how it came about that the Black Panthers chose the Black Panther as their symbol. Back then, I could be mistaken about this, but my memory is because a Black Panther, if you attack it, it retreats. If you attack it, it retreats. If you attack it and it's back against the wall, it leaps out at you. And for me, that metaphor works quite well for Russia. They gave 30 years, not a trivial period of time, over to trying to resolve this issue diplomatically. They made every possible effort to achieve a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. Now, it was not hard to resolve. In fact, it was very easy to resolve. and a resolution would not in the least have impinged on Ukrainian sovereignty. It required just two things. Number one, NATO, not Ukraine. NATO could simply have said, given the apparent provocation or seen as a provocation by Russia, Ukraine cannot join NATO now. That's all. That's all they had to say. And secondly, to implement what's called the Minsk II agreement to grant local autonomy to the Donbass region, the Russian-speaking region of Ukraine. If those two conditions were met, to my thinking, absolutely reasonable. Actually, I thought the most reasonable statement was made by your head of state before he became president, namely Lula. Lula was asked by Time magazine his opinion on the war in Ukraine. He said this was not a difficult issue to resolve. He was speaking then not about NATO, he said about the EU. He said the EU could simply have said to Zelensky, not now. Now is not the right time. Now it's true that Lula also denounced.
He did. I was about to say he did exactly the thing for which you're criticizing everyone else. He said, right. But let me interject there then and kind of use Lula as an example, but also in kind of defense of my own position. I'm not that big on making a big melodramatic showing that I'm condemning Russia or think Russia was unjustified in its invasion, though if someone asked me specifically for an answer, I will ultimately conclude it was unjustified. But you seem to be suggesting there's a kind of intellectual incoherence there. And let me just suggest to you that, for example, I spent a lot of years saying that the kind of official explanation for why 9/11 happened, namely they hate us for our freedoms, and all of that was preposterous, that of course there was provocation there as well. We had put troops in Saudi Arabia, which they regard as a heretical invasion of sacred land. We had supported Israel and their occupation of Palestine. Not that Osama bin Laden cared that much about that, but a lot of his supporters did. And most of all, we imposed a sanction regime on Iraq that killed 500,000 children, et cetera, that we had been infringing in that region for so many years in so many different ways that, of course, there was something provocative about that. And even the CIA has a word called blowback, which is where if you interfere in other countries, it's eventually going to come back to U.S. soil. But to note that doesn't mean you simultaneously have to say that 9/11 was morally justified, the attack was, or that it was legally or ethically justified as well. You can see provocation in what the West was doing in that region while still objecting to the path that was chosen. And in the case of Russia, could easily say, if my argument was that the U.S. had no right to invade Iraq or Vietnam or whatever without international approval, in violation of the UN Charter, that's also true of Russia. But I just say that to say I understand what you're saying, that sometimes people want to stay within the bounds of decency by saying, I hate Russia, I condemn Russia, but I don't think it's intellectually inconsistent either to both see provocation and view it as unjustified, the reaction.
Well, there are many things to say to that. And obviously, it's a fair point. But then you have to see whether the analogy works. Did Osama bin Laden spend 30 years trying to negotiate a settlement with the West over the issue of the Middle East? Did Osama bin Laden begin the war, as any war is begun, by targeting military targets? Now, you could say at some point, the war deteriorated and Russia, predictably but inexcusably, probably engaged in what are called, violations of international humanitarian law, war crimes. Yeah, Ukraine, fine. But that's not what happened. What happened was 30 years of negotiations. And it wasn't as if the situation on the ground was static. Had it been static, you could say, give the negotiations more time. But that's not what happened. What happened was, at some point, arms were pouring into Ukraine from NATO. At some point, NATO and Ukraine were engaging in joint military exercises. At some point, a massive attack seemed to be looming against the Donbass region. And then you have to ask yourself a simple question, though I admit the answer may not be simple. The simple question is, at what point do these provocations reach a threshold such that Russia has the right to respond? And I would want to emphasize that what happened there has to be seen in the broader context of the fact that the generation that's now ruling Russia, the Putin generation, he happens to be within 1 year of my age. He's 70, I'm going on 70. That generation has very vivid memories of invasion and war. And Russia, in my opinion, had the right to say it would not tolerate nuclear-tipped missiles on its border within 5 minutes range of Moscow.
Which was the American objection for the Cuban Missile Crisis, or very similar to it. And but Norman, hold on, let me just ask you. So when I discuss this issue with supporters of the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, or people who are all with their draped in their blue and yellow flags and the like, I present to them the alternative hypothesis that imagine China or Russia in Mexico changing the government of Mexico to a more pro-Moscow or pro-Beijing government the way the U.S. did in Kiev. Imagine tons of Russian or Chinese arms flowing into Mexico right on the other side of the U.S. border that are specifically designed to either deter U.S. forces or be used against it. I bet you most people who are saying that what Russia did is so unjustified would support U.S. actions against such a provocation in Mexico. They'd have no trouble seeing why that's very threatening behavior. But let me ask you that question. If China and Russia were as involved in Mexico in the same way as the U.S. is in Ukraine, would you support U.S. incursions, military incursions into Mexico, and then say it was a justifiable provocation?
Glenn, the problem with these kinds of questions is, how well does the analogy hold? Was the United States the victim of an invasion from either Mexico or the other example that's commonly given, or Canada, in which a tenth of its population was exterminated? The Nazis waged a war of extermination on the Eastern Front. Did Mexico wage a war of extermination on the United States? Did Canada wage a war of extermination on the United States?
But the U.S. was allied with Russia. I mean, you're basically melding German history and American history and saying the Russians rightly feared Germany and therefore look at the U.S. and kind of attach German crimes to the United States.
At the time, I don't want to go into the details now. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was planning an invasion of Cuba. It was at that point that the Russian staged missiles in Cuba to fend off the U.S. invasion. There was a very easy way to resolve that particular issue. The issue was resolved by the United States agreeing to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, the nuclear-tipped missiles it had in Turkey aimed at Russia, and to agree not to invade Cuba. There was a simple solution. The U.S. rejected it. Russia now put forth a simple solution: the neutrality of Ukraine, not to belong to an Eastern military bloc, not to belong to a Western military bloc, and to implement the accords that were reached to resolve the question of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. That, to me, is not a complicated question. It doesn't impinge in any way on Ukrainian sovereignty. It was a decision for NATO to make.
Of course. And
thank you for the application, but we're rejecting that application.
Exactly. The U.S. is not duty-bound to defend every country. Of course, every country would love to be defended in a pact where the U.S. says, if anyone touches your soil, we will go to war in your defense. Everybody would love that. It doesn't mean we're required to give that commitment. And of course, of course, I recognize all of these things the United States government has done in Ukraine as provocative, and I never thought I found myself in the position where I'm debating this war with somebody that wiggled into that side of me that you find yourself in. But I totally understand the point you're making, which is, look, if you're saying that what the U.S. has done is so provocative, so repeatedly, as I agree, at some point you have to say, well, the Russians got provoked. And I guess for me, you know, the framework is, as I said earlier, that we need some kind of consistent rules about when countries can just send their military across the border and wage war on another country. But I think Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.